Some of our films kind of have a pastoral quality to them, where they lead people through the metaphor. But then others, they tell a story maybe a little bit more like we often saw Jesus telling a story. A lot of times it felt like Jesus would tell a story and then just kind of drop the mic. I don't know what that story means or why he told it. And the wrestling and the digging into it was the point of the story. There's this thing that happens at church for songwriters, for creators, that we always have this like built-in audience. You always have a place to share the thing that you just made. And I found that even once that audience was gone and I had no venue to share it anymore, God was still giving me ideas. He was still inspiring me to tell stories. I realized, like, even apart from working in a church every day, this is what I'm made to do. The call on you as a creative person is to keep stewarding that curiosity, to make things not because you have an audience, but because you're made to make them.
Bravingbird, welcome to the Churchfront Worship and Tech Podcast.
Hey, thank you. It's our pleasure.
Hey guys, why don't you, before we kind of dive into the episode today, why don't you just introduce yourself to our listeners, tell us who you are, what you do, and what you're up to these days.
Yeah. So my name is Matt, and I'm a filmmaker at Bravingbird. So I'm responsible for cinematography, editing, color grading, those kinds of things, and some story development. But most of that's this guy here.
What about your family?
Oh yeah, I do have one of those. I've got, so I'm married we're in our 13th year, and everything seems to be going well still. So. Lucky 13. Got two kids, two boys, Edison and Ridley, 8 and 7. And so our lives are pretty full with those two. But so much fun, such a great age too.
I love it.
And my name is Nick Benoit. I'm the creative director at Bravingbird and one of the co-founders. And I spent about the last 15 years of my life as creative director at various churches. And then about 2.5 years ago, started this with a really good friend of mine. And then my wife and I, we have been married. We're coming up on 20 years next month. Wow. That's crazy.
Congrats.
Awesome.
20 years next month. We got 3 kids, aged 7 through 13. And so they keep things, they fill in all the gaps where work doesn't fill, I guess.
Yeah, I love it. Well, it's great to meet you guys. Great to have you guys on the show. And it's been a pleasure to kind of chat preemptively about what you guys are up to at Bravingbird. It's kind of it's come to me in a number of funnels. One of our coaches in worship ministry school here at Churchfront sent me a Slack the other day and said, I think you should check these guys out. Looks like they're doing some really cool stuff. Might be a good, episode for the podcast to get in front of people's ears and eyes and just kind of inform people on what they're doing. And when I spend some time, 5 minutes on your website, it's like the vision for this thing is incredible. And so I love to kind of unpack it as we go through this episode. But why don't you guys walk me through maybe kind of your background? I mean, I know, Matt, you mentioned you're a videographer, correct? Yeah?
Yeah. So I've been working as a filmmaker, doing cinematography, editing, some directing throughout the years, probably for 11 years now, I think.
Wow.
And a lot of that experience started out in a marketing firm working there, but then was always compelled to tell more stories. In a marketing firm, there's less you can do with that kind of a thing.
Sure.
At the same time, I was starting to get really involved in the church that I was a part of, and church filmmaking was kind of becoming something that, you could do and afford to do at the time a little bit more. And so that's when I sort of started working in ministry, worked at a few churches then for most of the past 11 years after that initial.
You can afford to do it means that it was a paying position, right? That you could make you could make your passion and your gift actually provide for your family, which is incredible. And you're right. I mean, around that time, the kind of the storytelling, the videographer kind of creative role became really I think it started to become more popular as technology advanced in a number of key ways. So that's really cool to hear a little bit about your background. What about you, Nick, in kind of your ministry experience? What's your background like in terms of roles that you've had, jobs that you've done there?
Yeah, I'll go all the way back. So like I grew up in a very Christian household. I mean, I grew up in church, I grew up in youth group, and was always just a really creative kid. And then I went to a summer camp. Don't all the pivotal moments happen at camp?
Always.
I had this moment at summer camp between middle school and high school where I really felt this like supernatural call into ministry. And you kind of mentioned a second ago that it's only really been in the last 10 or 15 years that a lot of these creative roles have really started to be created at various churches. And I remember as a kid believing I was called into ministry. I didn't really have any framework for that kind of role. And so I kind of had this assumption that being in ministry meant being a youth pastor and then someday moving up to become the lead pastor. And so that's what I went to college to do. I was a Christian ministries major, and I was partway through my first semester, and I'm looking around at all the other kids that I'm in these classes with, and I realized these are not my people. And that's not saying anything against them. It was just the conversations that they were interested in and the future paths that they saw for themselves looked very painful for me personally. They just didn't fit who I was. They didn't fit the gifting that I felt like I had been given. But the whole time I still felt like all the creative stuff I used to do as a kid was stuff I was supposed to just set aside to grow up and become a pastor. But meanwhile in college, I'm spending all my time in the art building and the theater building and with the music kids and all the people who are telling stories essentially. Yeah. And so I abandoned ship on my Christian ministry major. I went into communications and theater and chased that thing down for about the next 5 years of my life. And then I went to work for a theater in Charlotte, North Carolina, that about a year after I got there went bankrupt, which, just for the record, was not my fault, but went bankrupt. And I had this come to Jesus moment again where I was like, God, what am I supposed to do with my life? And he was like, I already told you what to do with your life. But the thing that he made so much clearer to me in that moment was all the creative stuff, all the storytelling, all the things that I love to do that were outpourings of who he had made me to be. Those weren't things I was supposed to be leaving behind. And so I made one of those bargains with God. Okay, like if you can find me a creative job in a church somewhere, I don't even know what that looks like, but if you want to figure that out, I'll do it. And I think within 6 months, I ended up as the creative director at a church in San Diego area. And then I ended up becoming creative director at a church in Orange County, and then moved out to Illinois to be a part of Willow Creek. And so I had been creative directing for about 15 or so years before I left and ended up starting Bravingbird.
I'm going to date you a little bit and just, in a very non-offensive way, but we'll get there, to make a point.
Later we'll get to the part where you're offensive.
Maybe we'll get to the part where I'm offensive later. What were some of the creative branches of the church when you got into your first creative director job? Like if you looked at other churches, what was going on at that point?
Oh, I mean, drama ministry was so hot. I mean,
and we're talking theater productions, like scripts and musical
full scale. Yes, skits. The word skit. That was like the mainstay. Like if you could regularly produce a skit, like that felt like the epitome of what creativity in the church looked like.
When I hear skit, I think of kids ministry, but it was like very popular in main Sunday services.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that was the big one.
Big drama departments and everything, right?
Big drama departments. Often Willow at the time had a huge dance department too.
Okay, so now
video wasn't really on the radar yet.
Right. I have a follow-up question to that. when you look at ministries today in their creative departments, do you think that there's an element that's missing because we no longer do drama, dance, kind of special? I mean, there's a lot of churches that still do kind of special music, if you will, or programmed music. But like, do you think that was a season and now that season is done? Or do you feel like, man, was there some great fruit in that we are missing today?
I think that's a great question. And I think you're hitting the nail on the head when you say, are we missing some of what was great? I think we have these assumptions of what those ministries looked like. And most of our assumptions really pick out all the bad stuff, all the stuff that we can very quickly make fun of and treat as if it were a part of a different decade. But I think what was so beautiful about that period is the way the church seemed to, with open arms, welcome a lot more kinds of gifts to the table. And I think sometimes because of our hangups of how cheesy some of the results of that might have been, or just the quality level that sometimes we did or did not experience, I think we're so quick to dismiss it now that I wonder who would stand up and offer their gifts again if we found the right way to utilize them to tell stories.
The level of participation that used to be in those things. I mean, I remember like at one of the churches I worked at, they had the dance team and they put these massive extravaganza, and like they were really great. The dancers were like really great, like ballet artists and everything. But the number of people who volunteered to either be extras or to like do the stage design and like all, like it was people got super excited about that. And one of the things that was frustrating to me when I was working in these different filmmaker roles is how difficult it was to drum up that same excitement now for something new. Like I always had these dreams of like, what if we could bring together like a filmmaking team like the drama team used to be. I don't think at least for me, never was able to quite do that with like volunteers and stuff the way that I think I had hoped that would, happen.
Yeah.
So,
and
there was
you look
something
back,
like that.
Well, you look back at history too, and so much of what we know is incredible art, both visual, musical, portraits and paintings and things like that. And then full scores came from church, right? Came from, like, you look at Handel's Messiah, you look at stained glass windows that kind of depict the story of the gospel through these amazing, visual elements and colored glass. And you think back to, I mean, just a season where the church was kind of the, maybe the catalyst or the launching point of creativity in culture. I would just be curious, as people who have seen kind of that seasonal transition from live in action, church productions, volunteers participating, all the way to maybe a season now that we would look at that's definitely more video heavy. What do you think some of the pros and cons are of that, of kind of making that transition, but also, stepping into using kind of modern day technology to do what we used to do with just a bunch of church folks?
I think the danger could be not like losing that participation from people who are, for lack of a better word, like lay folks in the church who aren't being paid to be staff, in the church. Like being able to bring people in like that and be part of that whole vision was something I think that probably was pretty special about that particular time. And to be able to cultivate, because the standards of like excellence are so high, I think often it feels like difficult to bring people into that process. There also feels like there's things that you can kind of get away with live that you can't get away with, like acting that's kind of subpar is difficult, is a lot more acceptable live, I think, than it is when it's on screen, so like those are some of the things that I think are a little bit difficult.
I think one of the dangers is, how do I say this? If we become too much of the gatekeepers of what acceptable creativity looks like, I think, I guess that it asks the question, like, are we dumbing down what a congregation can even receive? Because the thing is, like, I think there are different creative mediums that speak to people in different kinds of ways. And some of us are more receptive to certain mediums than others. But I think that if we only live on a steady diet of one creative medium, we're not learning anything about how to receive and accept different kinds of messages. But also, are we tailoring everything to one specific taste level? So as a creative director, I've worked with lots of different kinds of artists, from painters to filmmakers to musicians to dancers. And there are some of those mediums that speak more personally to me than other ones. But I've tried to do my best to give them all access, to give them all a chance to tell the story. And sometimes what I found is my lack of speaking the language that their medium speaks actually opens a door for them to speak to more people. Because when I can say to them, like, I love the dance and I think it's beautiful and I don't always understand what I'm supposed to be receiving from it, it usually pushes them to say, okay, let me figure out how it can communicate even more.
That's
what
good.
Can we pair with it to, like, invite people in? And so I worry that we have pigeonholed only certain art forms as acceptable, and not because they're heretical or anything like that. But
yeah,
often one of the things when I would work in, when I was working a couple of churches, it was like I was the film guy, like just one member, like, which is probably the most common. There are a lot of people who have that experience, right? Where it's like you're the only person making videos for all the church. And I remember how many times it was like, oh, we have this great idea. Wouldn't that'd be a great video? And before asking the question, what is the best medium to tell this story or this idea through? It was like automatically the idea was we should make a video. And often I'd ask the question, is that, like, why is that the default? Like, I love making great videos, but like, should that always be the default? Is there a more compelling way to tell this particular person's story, or this, this idea that is kind of funny but has some truth attached to it? Is there another, like, way to do it that might be more compelling than just going to the default? And so I think, like, looking at what the idea is, what the story is, and asking the question, should this be what's the proper medium to tell the story through, I think is probably a crucial thing that, again, often gets missed, I think.
Before we continue on with the video, a quick word from our sponsor, the Worship Ministry School Accelerator Program. You may not know this, but in addition to all the YouTube content we're creating here at Churchfront, we also partner with local church worship and production ministries to help them hit their ministry goals. Over the past 4 years, we've worked personally with hundreds of worship ministries around the globe. We've helped churches navigate upgrading their worship tech, building better systems to grow their team of volunteers, as well as address any knowledge or skill gaps required for modern day worship ministry. When you join the Accelerator program, you get access to our entire library of online, on-demand courses, and you get unlimited access to our team of Churchfront coaches. To learn more about joining the program, click the link below this video to apply and schedule your free strategy session today. Now let's get back to the video.
Yeah, it's just good to reflect on some of that, because I think, especially if, I'm thinking about our listeners who are just getting into ministry. It's their first, ministry role, or maybe they've just been a little isolated, and maybe, culture in terms of their awareness of what else has come before. I just think it's important to reflect back, think through where we've come from, and kind of where we see this going to. And I love the perspective of kind of utilizing other elements, and also kind of thinking through what can we do to help others receive the message from the creative element. I think it's really, really an important step that the church can take some great strides in to see more fruit from it. I'd be curious to know what those initial conversations were like when you guys started to think through, man, creative director at church and a very successful, large, thriving church of Willow Creek in terms of their creative elements and processes. I'm sure that, we've talked to Todd. We've had Todd on the show multiple times from Philo, and so from all angles, it feels like, man, that was the spot to like really let your ideas run wild and kind of create these amazing environments and opportunities for creativity. What made you think and start to consider transitioning out and getting into this kind of nonprofit, more resource world for video?
Yeah, it wasn't it wasn't a strategic move, I guess. Being at Willow, so I was there for, I'm going to say a number, and I don't even know if it's true. I'm terrible with dates. So it might have been 6 years. It might have been 7. I don't really know. I have never been pushed as hard creatively. I've never grown so much as an artist. I've never been so supported. It was a beautiful experience in so many ways. And one of the things that it taught me was, I think I'd always understood the power of stories to some degree, but Willow taught it to me in a new way. And part of it's because I think whenever we're planning services for worship leaders, for creative directors, for tech directors, whoever, whenever we're creating a service, we're wanting all the elements to tie together perfectly. We want the whole service to tell one complete story from start to finish. And the interesting thing was, during so much of my time at Willow, that was an impossible task. Because a lot of times, and I'm sure a lot of creatives and worship leaders are experiencing this on a weekly basis in their church, that they don't know what's being taught on until Thursday, sometimes Saturday. Right, Thursday if we're lucky, right? And yet, at Willow in particular, we were asked to fill about 15 minutes of service time with creative output of some kind. And the runway that we needed to be able to do those things at the quality level that was being asked, Thursday wasn't going to work. We often needed minimum 2 weeks, often months, to create some of that stuff. And so there was this expectation that was sort of removed, that the first half of the service maybe didn't have to connect to the second half. And none of us would say that that was ideal. We liked best when we would, especially it would happen on Christmas and Easter, that basically that we could like seam everything together perfectly. So that wasn't like necessarily us living in a dream world, but what it did show us is that God could powerfully speak a message through story in the first half of the service that was completely different and yet no less powerful than what he would teach through expository teaching in the second half of the service.
It's good.
And so it was interesting at Willow, the way that it kind of brought teaching and worship and creativity and put them all on equal level and said, God can speak powerfully through all of these things. Some people were going to walk through the first 3 songs of worship and they will have met Jesus in the way that they needed to meet Jesus. Some people were going to sit through storytelling and that was all the message they needed. And then some people, for them that week, it was going to be the message at the end. And so we saw God get people's attention. We saw people wrestle with their faith. We saw them encounter God in powerful ways through story in particular. And it was this beautiful experience. And then one day, and this is a much longer story, but one day I felt like God said, "You're done." And it came very unexpectedly for me. I wasn't being kicked out the door, nor was I leaving because I was upset or anything like that. I just felt God say, "You're done." And it was baffling to me because my wife and I, we were all in. And I mean, a lot of people are aware that Willow has been through some crazy seasons in the last few years. And yet we were like, God, as long as you have us here, we are going to commit ourselves to you and to this church. And then all of a sudden it felt like that commission was over. Mm-hmm. And so I walked away not knowing exactly what was next. But I went through this season of soul searching where I realized suddenly you've removed the audience. There's this thing that happens at church for songwriters, for creators, that we always have this like built-in audience. You always have a place to share the thing that you just made. And I found that even once that audience was gone and I had no venue to share it anymore, God was still giving me ideas. He was still inspiring me to tell stories. And I realized, like, even apart from working in a church every day, this is what I'm made to do. And one day I was sitting around a bonfire in the backyard with one of my best friends, who's also the executive director of Bravingbird now. But at the time, neither of us knew what was next for us. And I said, man, I've got all these ideas and I don't know how to get them made. And he said, well, I know how to get stuff made, but I don't always have the right idea. And that's kind of where it was born. Because we said, I think the whole church could benefit from the power of story in the way that we saw Willow benefit.
Yeah.
But we hated that. Matt and I were talking about this earlier today. Like, we hated that so much of what we made was like had a one-time expiration date on it.
Almost disposable, like, yeah.
We would work so hard on these stories and then they basically just sit in an archive.
Yeah.
And so we started to dream, what if we could tell stories like that? And yet we made them available for everybody. And yeah, that's kind of where it started.
It's such an incredible story. And I love the heart behind making it available for everybody, because when I think it was either on your website or it was maybe even talking to Matt preemptively, but was just, yeah, those one time, you put so much sweat and tears and resources into a video that you're going to use for an Easter bumper or whatever it might be. And then it sits on an archive and you don't use it again. Most of the time, it's not like you're sharing that with churches, because churches don't know what other churches are doing, so it's not like they're like, hey, I saw that cool video that you made. Nowadays, probably with broadcasting and live streaming, it's more accessible to be like, oh, I saw your bumper. But, back in the day before COVID, it wasn't like we saw each other's services to even see what another church might be putting on. So the fact that this Bravingbird resource is kind of making things accessible for the capital C church, and available widespread, it's really an incredible, I think, shift that we will see moving forward in approach for creatives. What are some of the kind of identifiers of Bravingbird that when it comes to creative projects and things that, you said that you had all these ideas in your head, what are some of those key identifiers, or maybe the litmus test of how you pursue, like, what does Bravingbird actually, pursue producing?
One of the things that's really important to us is we like this idea of like looking at the world around us and what is the thing that sparks our curiosity. And if you dig a little bit, where's Jesus underneath all of that? So some of these things are like, what is the everyday thing that is a metaphor for something greater that you don't even know what it means exactly yet, but like just being curious about something. You can't help but see Jesus once you start to be curious about the world around you. He's within the fabric of all things. And so that's one of the things is like, what are these pictures that exist both in the, natural world and beyond that really have almost like expanded meanings. Like one of the things that we talk about metaphor quite a bit, and like one of the things we were asked to do when you're making something for a specific worship service was have a metaphor, sure, but then explain it within an inch of its life was something that it felt like you were being asked to do.
Make sure no one can miss the point ever.
Right. But what that does is you lose the power of that seed taking place in someone's life and what kind of spiritual reaction someone can have to that idea. And like, because stories get under our skin, and when the metaphor is expansive and not so specific, you start to, and this is one of the things I love so much about filmmaking and cinema, is like when you see images, you start to project yourself onto those ideas. You start to project yourself into that metaphor in your own individual story. And so now instead of having one meaning, there's multiple meanings that are individualized to that person. Because a great metaphor can have not just one truth, but so many different truths. And so that's, I think, one of the biggest things that we're looking at is like, how can something be expansive for people? Let's find a great metaphor. We see all these different things that it could mean, but then rather than picking just one of those things, let's just tell a really great story and then allow whoever is using that resource to what speaks to them through that, and then how can they share that with other people is one of the things that I get really excited about that.
Love it.
Yeah, we try to tell stories that fit the whole gamut of being really clear and being really obtuse. And maybe not obtuse, but just open for interpretation. Yeah. They can mean more than one possible thing. So some of our films, they do kind of come out and explain it. And they kind of have a pastoral quality to them where they lead people through the metaphor. But then others, they tell a story maybe a little bit more like we often saw Jesus telling a story where, man, a lot of times it felt like Jesus would tell a story and then just kind of drop the mic.
Credits roll.
Right. And like Jesus out. And people are sitting there going, I don't know what that story means or why he told it. And the wrestling and the digging into it was the point of the story. That's and good. I think we're often afraid of that. And so that's part of why we're telling all kinds of different stories, some that drop the mic and walk away, and then some that lead people through it. Because I think as we get more accustomed to using stories in our churches, we're gonna need lots of different types. So I don't think we have one specific lane that we're aimed at.
Yeah. And one of the things I'd love to clarify, even for the listeners, is that you guys, primarily the avenue that's on your website is through video, right? You've created and launched with a number of videos already, but the word or maybe the label I've heard you guys use countless times on this interview already is storyteller, right? So, how would you describe Bravingbird in reference to what element you use to do the storytelling? Is it mainly video, or do you have other avenues? Like for our listeners who are brand new to you guys, how would you describe what you guys do?
Yeah, Bravingbird tells stories that start conversations, and primarily, really exclusively right now, our stories are through the medium of video. It's churches are so used to plugging in videos into their liturgy, into their weekend services. And we have a lot of experience in filmmaking. And so that feels like the right bread and butter kind of place to start. And we're holding this whole thing really open-handedly, but we don't know what the future is going to look like. And that's why even throughout our website, you'll see that we stress story language and not exclusively film, because I think there might be open doors down the road of what that looks like. I can't make any promises, but we get excited about books. We get excited about podcasts. We get excited about any potential medium for sharing stories that could benefit the church.
Yeah.
One of the things specifically that this was new to me when I started working with Nick at Willow Creek, was there would be these mixed experiences of video playing in the background, and then Nick would perform live, either spoken word or story tell live with like these beautiful images behind him that were pointing in one direction and that kind in another direction. And that kind of storytelling, that sort of like mixing of different elements, is something that is really interesting. And I don't know, like, it feels like I think we get pretty curious about a lot of different possibilities, but Yeah.
Us creatives, man, you can't give us like an inch of an idea because we'll just get super jazzed about it and run with it. But you got to be careful because you got to do it well, right? So you got to do it with excellence. But I'm curious, I mean, walk me through like the process for you guys, because right now, you do have some published videos on the site, but they're not just film. You have music, you've got scores in it, you've got narration. So could you maybe even give us like a flyover view of what the production process looks like for you guys right now, start to finish? Who are you guys using? Like, how are you guys bringing in some of those other elements besides film? Because I would imagine some of the videography is done in-house or, with your own team. But who else are you resourcing? How are you incorporating them into the project? What's that look like?
Yeah, there is a network of collaborators that we get to work with, and some of that's just been out of necessity. You talked earlier about how much do churches share with each other? And when we were at Willow in particular, the ethos was always, we'll share anything. Yeah. Anybody can have anything we've ever made. But first, you had to know to ask. And second of all, usually there were elements of whatever we made that were licensed content. Often we were grabbing music from Musicbed or something like that. And so when a church would say, hey, can we use that video? We'd be like, yes. And we will give it to you as soon as you show us your licensing agreement for the music that we had to license. And so
or like actor agreements would be the other thing too.
Actor agreements, exactly.
Yep.
What had the actors agreed to at the outset? Were we allowed to release this content? It's just, there were so many hurdles to jump through. And so when we started Bravingbird, we didn't want any of those hurdles to be in anybody's way. And so we said, we actually have to own all of this from start to finish to be able to give it away. And so all of the filming, all of the music has to be custom written for our videos so that we can own full rights to it. All of the sound design, the actors' agreements have to be set up in a way that these people know it's being shared for free. And so out of the necessity of that, it has brought this network of collaborators together that's really beautiful. Because one of the things we knew that we wanted to be is for artists. we wanted working with us to be certainly in our best interest, but in the best interest of the artists too. So all of our agreements with the artists say, we have full rights to use the work that you've created with this project in mind, but so do you. If you have a way to gain monetarily or to license it to someone else, please do. None of our agreements are exclusive because we want artists to win. And so it has brought together this team of people from different composers and different performers and filmmakers and sound technicians and all kinds of different people who go into every single project we make.
Yeah. And it's been so fun to specifically with music composition, using royalty-free music is often such a it's so narrow, to do that, to have, it feels like a luxury now to be able to have the time to hire a composer to, make a custom score. And the number of times that our collaborators will show us something in the film that we didn't know existed through their art themselves, has been super exciting. You'll hear a phrase from a musical phrase and you're like, oh wow, now that means something that I didn't know that it meant before. Whereas before we're trying to make, not custom track work. And so I don't know, it's been really fun working with other people. And yeah, some great folks that we get to work with.
But it does mean every project takes a long time.
Yeah.
Because we're a very small team. There's only 4 of us on staff at Bravingbird. Everybody else is contract and collaborators. And so the process of putting these films together can be anywhere from 2 months to 12 months. So it's a thing.
Lining up any kind of visual project takes so much time on set, to film it. But then the preemptive planning and even the post, execution is it might be the lengthiest project that you can ever endeavor upon, because it just does it. Everything is so time consuming. So very impressive that you guys are four people deep, contracting out. That I think that's the sweet spot, selfishly, because Churchfront is also 4 people deep. So we've just got a team of 4, and we're cruising, and we love it. We're like, man, it'd be fun to scale, but it also it complicates things. So it's nice when it's a tight knit group. You can all talk and kind of get to the point really quickly on vision and clarity. So yeah, it's impressive to hear what you guys, and I've seen the videos, man, they're incredible. Like if listeners, you got to get over to the website, check out what they've put out thus far, because it is impressive. It's incredibly well done. I mean, every aspect of it is just gorgeous in the experience of watching it, and then you watch it again because you want to get kind of the next layer of the onion, if you will, and you keep thinking, oh, I wonder if I watched it again even on different devices. I'm like, okay, that has a different kind of impact, whether I'm watching it on an iPad or a phone or my TV in my living room. It just is a different experience. So it's really encourage people to go check it out. I have one final question for you guys, kind of as a wrap, to maybe thinking more towards, church employees or church members who are passionate about creating. They've got a skill in music or video, film, poetry, those kind of things that would contribute towards maybe something like this. And they're thinking, I would love to, contribute to my church. Maybe their church doesn't do it right now, and they're just thinking, man, if I could just even take the first step towards that. The primary question that I have would be, how do you guys get inspired towards a project? Like what is your process like in beginning to create? Because I think we can oftentimes almost muscle into existence a piece of content. Like you guys said, you'd be given this idea, that'd be a great thing for a video, right? And it's almost like the video is the way through which we accomplish this goal. It's not a creative product that we kind of are inspired to make, and we kind of pursue that dream. How would you guys describe your creative process towards what you make at Bravingbird, and how those ideas come to fruition, if you will?
One thing on that, I think one of the things that was a little bit frustrating when you're working in church is often you're like pointing at something very specific. There's like a very specific problem that needs to be solved. There's something that you're trying to communicate. And I think one of the things that we found is like, we're free from that constraint now to not have to aim so specifically. I think a lot of times, like, you try really hard to make the metaphor work toward, like you've got to tell this, we've got Easter coming up and we want to tell a story about, the resurrection of Jesus. And now you're thinking so specifically, okay, how do I reverse engineer this idea, rather than starting with the thing that you're curious about and asking what it actually means.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of that happens. This is kind of the beginning part, is like, what's curious? What are we curious about?
Yeah. I mean, Matt talked earlier about, God as creator of everything has written his name in everything. And so we try to live every day asking the question in conversations, in a long walk, in whatever we encounter, from the microphone that's in front of my face to ruminating on this conversation later, and asking the question, what does that have to say about who God is? Mm-hmm. Like if I peel back a couple layers of that onion, is there a place where God has written his name in there? And so we get curious about trees. We get curious about how bread gets made. We get curious about how horses get trained. And as we get curious and we start to make discoveries ourselves about what those things might have to say about who God is and what his relationship is toward us, we get excited to share those things. And so what I would hope anybody who encounters Bravingbird stuff would find is that there is a certain level of authenticity to everything we do. And it's because we are genuinely excited to share the discoveries that we've found. Mm-hmm. But I think going back to your question of if you're someone who has creative inclinations, storytelling inclinations, and you're part of a church and you're wondering, is there a place for me? I don't know what the first step is to get involved necessarily. I think that's going to be different at every single church. But I think the call on you as a creative person is to keep stewarding that curiosity.
That's good.
To make things, again, to make things not because you have an audience, but because you're made to make them.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I guess I have to believe that God will find the right audience. And maybe sometimes that audience is only going to be him.
Yeah.
And that can be a really good calling. But yeah, make it because you're made to make it.
I like that. So many good perspectives, pieces of advice, guidance, insight to the creative journey, and even the role that it can play in the church, how to even take that next step in a creative role in your ministry context. I want you guys to be able to have a chance to share what Bravingbird is.
We started Bravingbird because we believe in the power of story. You see the way that Jesus tells stories throughout Scripture. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, fully a third, we have these recorded words of Jesus. Like, these are precious words. And Jesus uses a third of them to tell stories.
Yeah.
And Mark chapter 4, verse 34 says, this is from the Message, but it says Jesus was never without a story when he spoke. Every time he opened his mouth, stories came tumbling out, which what that tells me is even though a third of the words we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are him telling stories, we probably only have a fraction of the stories he told. And he told stories because he knew they engaged people differently. That it engaged the emotions, it engaged the memory, it engaged imagination. When we tell stories, we appeal to the whole of what a person is. And throughout history, stories have been how we have passed on history, how we have passed on knowledge and lessons. And I think sometimes in the church we miss it. I think we believe, rightly so, in the power of biblical teaching, but sometimes to the detriment of the power of story. And I think it's when those two things come together that there's real power. When we speak not only to the mind, but also appeal to the emotion and the heart and the imagination. And so we want to tell those kinds of stories that wrap the gospel, that the gospel is right at the core of them. And sometimes they need to be unpacked and sometimes they're a little clearer, but stories that are memorable, that start people thinking, that start conversations. And then I think the kicker is that we give them away for free. We have witnessed the power of stories so many times that we don't want there to be any hindrance to people using stories. We want to see them in the life of churches. We want to see them in the life of organizations, of small groups, and even individuals sharing these stories with people that they know and love to start the kind of conversations about the things that mean the most to them. And so, yeah, we tell stories that start conversations and we give them away for free.
If they want to follow along, can you guys give us the places to reach you guys or to follow along with what you guys are doing?
Bravingbird.com is probably the best place to go to see our stories, to see how you can give and partner with us, and to find out kind of what we're up to next. We're going to start sharing things about what our upcoming releases will be. And there's a place, again, everything we make is free. The only thing we ask is that you sign up for an account just to say, here's who I am and here's how I hope to use it.
It's really free.
I know, like people don't really believe this. It's totally free.
Yeah.
Especially because your email address didn't cost you any money to make. So it's actually free.
It's actually free. And that's the thing. Like, I think people are like, if it's free, why do I even need an account? And the truth is, Lawyers. Because people have to sign a terms and conditions, and the only way to do that is if they create an account. But also, there's a place where you can click to get updates or not when you create that account. If you want to know what upcoming releases are and that kind of stuff, you can do that. But again, we really do mean it. It's all free.
One of the things that's nice about Experience on the website too is we've provided some different scripture and different themes and suggestions like that of ways that you can use the films. I mean, I think the thing that we really, really would love to see is where it feels like, how do I say this? That we're collaborating with you. Like we want it to feel like there's something on, there's something on here that will help you, tell whatever story it is that you're trying to tell with the help of, the resources that we have. And so
it's really good.
There's lots of different ways. I feel like there's lots of different ways that each film can be used and could be used in, both in the application and then the places that it could be used. And I
love that. It's a really unique posture. What is any teasers? You don't have to do any spoilers, but any teasers of what the next idea that's simmering in the old hopper is?
We've got one coming up that we're probably going to release. I mean, from the date we're recording this, we're probably going to release it in. It's about a month.
Yeah,
it's about a month.
Yeah.
And I'm not even going to say that much about it, except for it is no exaggeration it's probably the most special piece I've ever made. Wow. I don't know that I've ever been this proud of a piece of filmmaking. And I think we're telling a particular person's story in a really authentic and beautiful way. And I think one of the things that's been coolest about this project is that the process behind the scenes has been at least as beautiful as what the final product will be.
Love that.
And that's really important to us, that people were cared for and pastored and loved in the process, not just by the final product. So we're super excited about that one.
Yeah. The process, and just to bounce off that, the process totally matters 100%. And I think having all of us know what it's like to work under the gun, and in the midst of that stress to be able to, I don't believe that better art is created because of suffering necessarily. I think you can, it is going to be stressful, but I think you can still have a good time and enjoy the people that you're with, and still create something special. And that's one of the things that's so excited about when I'm excited about this film that we're making right now, but I'm also just look back upon it with fondness throughout every part of the process because the people were so fantastic every step of the way.
Yep.
And I don't know, it's just fun.
It makes it easier when you're editing to recall on it fondly than to be bitter or jaded against what that experience was like as you're chopping up the rough cut or the A-roll and you're going, that just sucked. You're actually fond of the process.
Yep.
Absolutely. One of the other projects I think we're getting excited about, it's at the very earliest stages, is about the will of God, which is a really big topic. But we're sort of butting it up against this metaphor about learning to cook. And I think a lot of us in life, we come to these moments of decision where we have to decide who are we going to marry, what career are we going to take, just these massive life decisions. And we all kind of wish that we had a step-by-step recipe. Yeah. And yet I'm not sure that the will of God works quite like that most of the time. Yeah. So we're making a piece about that.
I love it. Well, I'm really excited for you guys, and I'm just excited because I mean, again, I think our audience will